She was just a broke waitress in a forgotten town. He was a stranger with nothing but rain, soaked clothes, and tired eyes. One plate of food changed both their lives forever. What she didn't know, he was a hidden millionaire. And he would never forget her kindness. From heartbreak to hope, from sacrifice to second chances. This is a story that will break you and heal you all at once. Where are you watching from? If this touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more powerful tales that stay with you long after they end. The neon sign above Rosie's Diner flickered weakly in the downpour, casting a twitching pink glow onto the rain. Slick pavement. It was past midnight, and the highway outside was a forgotten stretch of road no one had reason to take him o'er. Unless they were lost, desperate, or trying to disappear. Inside the diner, the warmth clashed with the cold storm pressing against the fogged windows. A faded country song hummed softly from the jukebox in the corner, playing more out of habit than for anyone's enjoyment. The only customer, a trucker with a grizzled beard and hollow eyes, nursed his third refill of coffee, staring blankly at the counter. Behind that counter, Maya Brooks was wiping down the same spot on the laminate surface for the third time. Not because it needed cleaning, but because her aching feet begged her to stop moving. Her apron smelled like bacon grease and burnt toast, and her ponytail had slipped into a loose mess at the nape of her neck. She glanced at the clock. One more hour, just one more hour, and then she could go home to the cold apartment she shared with her younger brother, and maybe, just maybe, split a can of soup, if they hadn't already eaten it. The bell above the door jingled, sharp and jarring in the stillness. Maya froze. No one came in this late. The storm alone should have kept people away. But when she looked up, her breath hitched slightly. A man stood just inside the doorway, his frame backlit by the harsh glow from the parking lot's lone flickering light. Water dripped from the ends of his dark, matted hair, pooling onto the floor around his worn boots. His coat was soaked through, torn at the sleeve, and streaked with dirt. He didn't move for a moment, just stood there with shallow breaths, his shoulders hunched, his eyes scanning the diner like he was still deciding whether it was real. Maya's instincts flared, fear at first, caution. But something in his expression stilled her. His eyes were hollow, yes, but not threatening. They were the eyes of a man who hadn't slept well in weeks, maybe months. She'd seen that look before, on veterans who passed through, on single moms who counted their change in front of the register, on herself some nights. He shuffled forward, each step a slow negotiation with gravity. When he reached the counter, he pulled himself onto the stool and let out a long breath like it physically hurt to sit down. I don't have any money, he said, voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. But I could pay you back, I swear. He looked toward the kitchen window, where one last plate sat under the heat lamp. I just need something to eat. Maya's hand tightened around the dish towel. That plate was hers. Her dinner. She'd been saving it since the start of her shift, planning to eat before dragging herself home. It wasn't much. Some scrambled eggs, a slice of dry toast, and 2 sad-looking sausage links. But it was the only thing she had waiting for her tonight. The man's gaze lingered on the plate like a starving animal, spotting a way out of its cage. Up close, she could see how pale he was, how sharp his cheekbones cut under the grime and water. He wasn't just hungry. He was unraveling. Without a word, Maya turned, walked to the kitchen window, grabbed the plate, and set it down in front of him. He didn't move. Just stared at it, stunned. Eat, she said softly. His eyes flicked up to hers. They looked almost scared. Are you sure? She nodded. The first bite was slow, hesitant. The second came faster. Then hunger took over, and he devoured the food like it was the first real meal he'd had in days. Maya watched him, arms folded, a quiet ache in her chest. She had nothing. She had no safety net, no backup plan, no secret trust fund. But somehow, watching him eat made her feel richer than she had in years. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Maybe it was the fact that, for once, she could actually help someone, even if only for a night. He finished in minutes, then looked up at her again, expression softer now. "I don't know how to thank you." She shrugged. "You don't have to." His brows drew together, confused. "No one's done something like this for me in a long time." "Well," she said, managing a small smile, "maybe someone should have." He stood, shaky but steadier now, and hesitated at the door. Rain still poured outside. He looked over his shoulder. "I won't forget this." And then he vanished into the storm. Maya's sneakers squeaked softly on the damp stairs as she climbed to the third floor of the old brick building. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Kresnick across the hall always left her windows open when she cooked. The dim ceiling light buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to give everything a sickly yellow tint. By the time Maya reached the door of apartment 3, she was shivering, her uniform damp from the wind and cold that had followed her home. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers stiff, then pushed the door open with her shoulder. The heat hadn't kicked in. Again, the room greeted her with its usual chill, the scent of old carpet and leftover soup still lingering in the air. It was a small place. Barely enough space for the love seat that doubled as a bed, a tiny kitchenette with a crooked stovetop, and a cramped bathroom with a leaky faucet that echoed all night. But it was home, for now. She dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. The kind of tired that lived in her bones had settled in for the night. There were no messages on the answering machine. That was good. It meant the landlord hadn't called again. Yet. "Maya," a sleepy voice murmured from the couch. She turned. Her younger brother Liam blinked up at her, his face pale in the weak lamplight. The thin blanket covering him was twisted around his legs, one of his arms resting awkwardly against the cushions. "Hey," she said softly, crossing the room. "Did I wake you?" He shook his head, trying to sit up, but winced and stopped. The accident last year had left him with a lingering back injury and a steady dependence on pain meds. Ones that their insurance barely covered. How was the diner? She offered a half smile, crouching beside him. "Same as always. Cold coffee." He chuckled weakly, living the dream. Maya laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. She reached up to the counter, grabbing the orange pill bottle. Shaking it gently, she counted the remaining tablets. 3, maybe 4, if she split one. She swallowed hard. "Here, take one," she said, handing it to him with a glass of tap water. "You'll sleep better." He gave her a long look. "Did you eat?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, at the diner." It wasn't a complete lie. She had eaten. Sort of. She'd eaten the silence, the warmth of watching someone else be full for once. That had to count for something. Liam settled back onto the couch, already half asleep again. Maya tucked the blanket around him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead the way their mother used to do. For a moment, she just watched him breathe, counting each inhale like a prayer. Then came the knock. It was firm. Familiar. She crossed to the door slowly. her bare feet quiet on the cold floor. She already knew who it was. She opened it only halfway. "Evening, Maya," said Mr. Delaney, the landlord. He was wearing his usual puffer jacket and had his clipboard in hand. "Hi," she said, trying to sound chipper. "I gave you until last Friday," he said bluntly. "We're now on Wednesday." "I know," she said quickly. My tips have been low, and my brother—" "I get it," he interrupted, his tone not unkind, just tired. "But I've got repairs to pay for, and bills of my own. I can't carry you any longer." Maya's heart pounded. "Just until the weekend, please. I'll get the money." He studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. 3 days. She closed the door softly, pressing her forehead to the cool wood. 3 days. She didn't even have $20 to her name. Rent was $650. There were no miracles waiting at the bottom of her apron pocket. She turned back to the room. Liam was asleep again, the orange pill bottle resting on the floor by the couch. She bent to pick it up, turning it over in her hands. No refills left, no money to refill them even if there were. She curled up in the frayed armchair by the window and pulled her knees to her chest. The city outside was quiet, as if the whole world had gone on without her. She thought about the man from the diner, the way he'd looked at her, like she'd done something extraordinary. But here in the silence, she didn't feel extraordinary. She just felt tired. Still, she didn't regret it, not feeding him. Not that night. But as the room grew colder and the weight of the unpaid bills settled heavy on her chest, one question repeated in her head like a whispered storm. How much longer could she keep this up? The morning light struggled to break through the gray clouds that hovered low over the city. Maya stood by the sink, clutching a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee, watching a single droplet of water trail down the cracked window. It had been 2 days since Mr. Delaney gave her the ultimatum. 48 hours since she promised money that didn't exist. She hadn't told Liam. She couldn't. He was finally sleeping a little better, thanks to the last of the pills. And she couldn't add fear to the pile of things weighing him down. She took a small sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. The power had flickered twice during the night, and the fridge was on its last leg. The silence of the apartment wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, ominous. She glanced at the clock. Almost time for her shift. Another day of wiping down counters, forcing smiles, and praying for tips, generous enough to scrape together something. Anything. A knock at the door startled her, sharp and unexpected. Not the landlord again, not yet. She crossed the living room cautiously and opened it. No one was there. Confused, she stepped into the hall, looking left and right. Nothing but the faded wallpaper and dim lights. But at her feet was a thick cream-colored envelope, neatly sealed. Her name written across the front in beautiful, looping handwriting. Maya Brooks. Her heartbeat spiked. She knelt down, picked it up, and carried it inside. There was no return address, no stamp. Just her name. Inside, tucked between a heavy card and a folded note, was a plane ticket. First class, one way, Seattle. Her eyes widened. The note was short, written in the same elegant hand. "You gave hope when I had none. Come to this address. Trust me." She stared at the message for a long time. Could it be? Could it be? Her mind leapt back to that night. The rain, the plate of food, the man's eyes when he'd said, "I won't forget this." She read the note again. Her fingers trembled slightly as she set it down and reached for her phone. No messages. No messages, no missed calls. Whoever had left this hadn't tried to contact her. They hadn't asked. They'd just given. Her practical side shouted at her. It's a scam. Too good to be true. Nobody gives first-class plane tickets to struggling waitresses. And yet, there it was, in her hand. She glanced at Liam, still asleep on the couch, his face peaceful for the first time in days. He wouldn't understand. Maybe she didn't either. But what if it was real? What if it was real? What if someone had seen her? Not just the uniform or the tired eyes, but her, the rest of the day, passed in a blur. At Rosie's diner, every sound was distant, muffled under the hum of her thoughts. She moved on autopilot, pouring coffee, refilling syrup, nodding through orders while the ticket burned a hole in her bag. When the shift ended, she didn't even hesitate. She clocked out, walked home, and packed a bag with her few decent clothes. Jeans, a blouse that didn't have stains, the photo of her and Liam from 3 years ago at the county fair, and the note. She wrote a letter to Liam, folding it carefully and leaving it beside his pillow with a small bundle of cash. Her tips from the week. Enough for a few groceries and maybe a refill of the prescription if she begged the pharmacist again. She told him she'd be back soon, that she was chasing something that might help them both. She didn't say how afraid she was to leave, or how hopeful. At dawn, she boarded the plane. The seat was softer than anything she'd ever sat on. The window looked out over the clouds, and the sky was endless and blue. Maya kept her fingers curled tightly around the note, reading it again and again and again, as if it might change. She didn't know who he really was. She didn't know what waited in Seattle. But for the first time in a long time, the unknown didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a door finally cracking open. And she was ready to walk through it. The cab rolled to a slow stop at the edge of a private road, its tires crunching over the smooth gravel that shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Maya leaned forward, pressing her palm against the window, her breath catching as her eyes locked onto the gate in front of them. Towering black iron bars curved into elegant arches, and in the center, in golden cursive letters, read the Ridgemont Estate. Beyond the gate, a long stone path wound up a gentle hill, flanked by towering pines and blooming lavender bushes. At the top, like something out of a dream or a movie, sat a mansion so stunning it looked like it had been carved from glass and sunlight. Maya blinked, momentarily overwhelmed. This couldn't be real. She glanced down at the note clutched in her hand, the one that had arrived without explanation or return address, the one that led her here. She looked at the driver through the rearview mirror, and he raised a brow. "You sure this is the place?" "No," she whispered. Her voice caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. But she nodded anyway, and stepped out of the car. The wind was softer here, fragrant with fresh pine and something sweeter. Jasmine maybe. Her sneakers crunched quietly as she walked up to the gate. Before she could lift her hand to touch the call box, it buzzed on its own. The gates creaked open in eerie silence, as if they had been expecting her all along. Her stomach fluttered. This wasn't just out of her comfort zone. It was another universe entirely. At the end of the path, massive oak double doors opened before she could even knock. A man in a tailored gray suit, likely in his 60s, greeted her with a polite nod. "Miss Brooks, welcome. Mr. Carter is expecting you." Maya's legs moved on instinct as she followed him inside, though her mind spun wildly with questions. The foyer alone was bigger than her entire apartment. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and a chandelier the size of a car hung above, casting dappled light onto the cream walls. Everything smelled faintly of citrus and polish. Oil paintings lined the hallway as they moved, and Maya felt like each one was watching her, silently judging. The man in the suit led her to a sunlit room with tall windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. And there, sitting on a sleek leather couch, was the last person she expected to see. He looked different, yet unmistakable. The rain-soaked stranger from the diner now wore a navy blue dress shirt, the sleeves rolled neatly at his forearms. His dark hair was no longer matted but carefully styled, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced with something calm, though still heavy, like the sea before a storm. He stood as she entered, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Maya," he said. Her throat went dry. "You're Evan Carter," he nodded. "Founder of Carter Lane Capital." He gave a sheepish shrug, as if embarrassed by the title. "And the guy who once ate your dinner like it was the last meal on earth." She stared at him, her bag still hanging from one shoulder. He motioned for her to sit. "It's a long story." Maya didn't move. "Start talking." Evan let out a breath, nodding. "Fair. That night at the diner. I wasn't lying. I didn't have any money. I'd left everything behind. My phone, my wallet, my car. I just walked. For hours. Days maybe. I didn't want to be found." "Why?" she asked, folding her arms. "Because I lost everything," he said quietly. "Not financially. Personally. My business partner, my best friend, betrayed me. And someone I trusted with my heart left when things got hard. I didn't know who I was anymore. So I ran. I let it all go." Maya's expression softened slightly. She hadn't expected that. Evan looked at her, his voice steadier now. "But then I met you. And you saw me. Not the billionaire, not the wreck. Just me. And you gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time." "What?" she asked, still guarded. "Grace," he said simply. "Kindness without strings. No judgment. No curiosity. Just a plate of food and a warm place to breathe." Silence fell between them for a beat. "I sent that note because I wanted to return the favor," he added. "Not out of pity, but because I believe in people who do the right thing when no one's watching." Maya sat down slowly, still watching him with wary eyes. "So, what now?" Evan leaned forward. "Now, I offer you a choice. A real one. Come work for me. Learn something new. Build something. And if it's not for you, you can walk away. No strings." Maya's heart pounded. She didn't trust easily. She didn't dream easily either. But this felt different. She looked out the window, at the sky, so wide and blue it hurt. And for the first time, she let herself wonder, Maya hadn't said yes right away. After Evan made the offer, she spent the next hour wandering the garden outside his estate, her thoughts buzzing louder than the bees circling the lavender. The idea of working for a company like Carter, Lane Capital felt so far removed from anything she'd ever imagined for herself. Business meetings, offices with glass walls. She barely knew what a portfolio was, let alone how to read one. But the way Evan had spoken, not like she was some charity case, but like someone who deserved a shot. It had stirred something deep in her chest. So the next morning, she stood at the foot of a towering glass building in downtown Seattle, her thrift store blazer clutched tightly around her. The name Carter Lane Capital gleamed in steel letters above the entrance. Her reflection in the tinted glass doors looked as uncertain as she felt. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked inside. The lobby was sleek and quiet, all cool marble and minimalist furniture. Everyone who passed her looked like they belonged. Sharply dressed, confident, moving fast, like the world would trip without them. Maya swallowed hard. She suddenly felt like a fraud. A waitress in borrowed heels pretending she hadn't spent last week choosing between rent and painkillers for her brother. At the front desk, a woman with a sleek bob and perfect lipstick gave her a thin smile. "Miss Brooks, Mr. Carter is expecting you." Elevator to the 19th floor. The elevator ride was painfully silent. Maya counted the floors with every ding, gripping the strap of her tote bag like it was a lifeline. When the doors opened, she was greeted by a whirlwind of motion. Phones rang. People buzzed past her in designer shoes. Voices murmured over wireless headsets. The office space was all glass and light, open and modern, yet somehow colder than any winter night back in Montana. Evan met her at the entrance to the floor, dressed in slacks and a charcoal button-down, no tie. He smiled, hands in his pockets. "You came?" She managed a nervous smile, still deciding if that was brave or stupid. He chuckled and gestured for her to follow. "Let's find out." He led her to a quiet corner office. Not a big one, but with a desk, a laptop, and a view of the water. "This is yours. You'll be working with our business development team. Assistant to Claire Morrigan. Don't let her high heels fool you. She's sharp as a scalpel." Maya took it in, heart thudding in her chest. Evan gave her a look. "You learn fast. You listen. You work hard. Everything else can be taught." The first week nearly broke her. Claire was exactly as Evan had said, sharp, intense, and terrifyingly efficient. Maya spent her days proofreading reports she barely understood, making color, coded spreadsheets, and trying to remember who was who in meetings that sounded like a foreign language. She stayed late every night, poring over articles on market trends, business etiquette, and Excel formulas. Her eyes burned, her head throbbed, and her self-doubt whispered louder than ever. Worse were looks, the whispers. She caught them near the coffee station, in elevators, by the copier. "Isn't that the girl Evan brought in? Didn't she used to be a waitress? Guess sleeping your way to the top still works." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they weren't true, but because they weren't, and she had no way to prove otherwise. One afternoon while printing a report, she heard it again. A woman's voice behind her, mocking. "She probably thinks Roy is some kind of salad dressing." Laughter followed. Maya froze, the paper trembling in her hand. Her cheeks burned. She wanted to scream, or run, or disappear. Instead, she turned, walked back to her office, shut the door, and sat in silence. Her chest was tight, eyes glassy. What was she even doing here? What was she even doing here? What made her think she could belong? A soft knock interrupted the spiral. Evan poked his head in. "You okay?" She opened her mouth to say fine, but the truth slipped out instead. "I don't belong here." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him.
"Says who?"
Maya gestured vaguely to the office beyond the glass walls. "Everyone." Evan looked at her for a long moment, then sat across from her. "I didn't hire you to impress them. I brought you here because you have something they don't." She blinked. "Like what?" "Heart," he said. "Realness. You know what it's like to struggle. To care. That's something most of them will never understand." Her throat tightened. He leaned forward. "But you have to believe it too, Maya, or none of this works. She looked down at her hands, then back up. Then I guess I better start trying. Evan smiled. That's my girl. And in that moment, even with a pounding head and a shattered sense of confidence, she felt something unexpected flicker in her chest. Hope. Hope. By the second week, Maya knew every crack in the office floor tiles. She also knew that if she timed it just right, she could avoid bumping into the people who never remembered her name but always remembered to whisper when she passed. The morning routine had become familiar. Show up early, coffee in hand, study the day's reports like her life depended on it, then brace herself for whatever Hurricane Claire Morrigan had in store. Claire didn't waste time with small talk. She spoke in clipped, precise sentences, typed faster than most people thought, and never looked up from her screen unless someone was bleeding or late. To Maya's credit, she was never late. But being on time didn't mean being accepted. Each morning meeting felt like a test Maya hadn't studied enough for. Business terms flew around the room like wasps. Mergers, quarterly projections, equity dilution. She scribbled in her notebook, trying to keep up, trying to keep up, trying to keep up, trying to make sense of a world that spoke a different language. The others barely noticed her. Or if they did, it was to shoot a glance her way that said, "Who let the waitress in?" Still, Maya showed up, stayed late, asked questions, read every article Evan sent her way. And when Claire noticed that her assistant had not only memorized the company's top 5 investors, but also started color-coding her reports with useful annotations, she gave a single approving nod. That was all Maya needed, a crack of light in a wall she'd been pushing against for days. But not everyone was rooting for her. The first sign came on a Wednesday morning. Maya had prepared a presentation summary for Claire, a clean breakdown of a potential client's portfolio. She had double-checked the numbers, formatted the slides, and even printed backup copies. Claire had approved it with a rare good work. But when the meeting started, the slides projected on the screen weren't hers. They were outdated, sloppy. The numbers were off. The client raised an eyebrow. Claire turned sharply to Maya, brows furrowed. "These aren't the revisions I asked for." Maya's mouth opened, stunned. I swear I updated them. I triple-checked. Claire didn't say anything. She just narrowed her eyes slightly and turned back to the client, salvaging the meeting with the grace of someone who had done this dance before. Maya sat frozen in her seat, stomach churning. Afterward, she returned to her desk, pulled up the files, and there they were. Her correct slides, dated, time-stamped, untouched. Someone had swapped them out. She looked around the office, suddenly aware of how many people had access to the drive. She had no proof, no name to pin to it. But something cold settled in her gut. Someone didn't want her here. The next few days were worse. Her login stopped working for certain databases. Her calendar mysteriously unsynced. Files disappeared and reappeared, sometimes subtly edited. Claire grew colder, less patient. It was subtle sabotage, but it was effective. On Friday, as Maya was organizing reports in the supply closet, she heard them. 2 voices, one male, one female. "Did you see her face during the meeting? Like a kicked puppy? I still don't get why Evan brought her in. She's not even qualified. She's a project. Waitresses don't belong in boardrooms." A beat of laughter. Footsteps. Maya didn't move. She didn't cry either. Not right then. She just stood there, her hands clenched around a stack of paper, breathing slowly through her nose, the fluorescent light above her flickering like it couldn't quite commit to staying on. Later that evening, when the office had emptied out, she stayed behind, sitting at her desk, with the city lights blinking beyond the window. She stared at the screen in front of her but didn't type. The voice in her head was louder now. Maybe they're right. She didn't hear him approach. "You look like someone who just got handed decaf instead of espresso," Evan said gently, leaning on her doorframe. She didn't smile, didn't even look up. "I think I made a mistake," she said quietly. He walked in, pulling up a chair beside her. "You didn't," he replied. She finally turned to him. "Everyone thinks I don't belong here." "They're wrong," he said firmly. Maya hesitated. "But what if they're not?" Evan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his tone quieter now. Do you remember that night at the diner?" She nodded. "You didn't ask who I was. You didn't care how I looked or what I could give you. You saw someone in pain. And you helped. That's who you are. And that is exactly who this place needs." For the first time in days, Maya let herself breathe. "You belong here, Maya," he said. "But it's not enough for me to believe it. You have to believe it too." She nodded slowly. "Then I guess I have work to do." Evan smiled. "Now you're speaking the language." From that night on, something shifted in Maya. It wasn't dramatic. No grand gestures, no bold declarations, but subtle, like the slow warming of air before a sunrise. She arrived earlier, stayed later. Her questions became sharper, her notes more detailed, and slowly she began to hear her own voice in meetings. Not loud or commanding, but steady. When someone dismissed her comment in a strategy session, she didn't shrink this time. She leaned forward, cleared her throat, and calmly repeated her point with data to back it up. Claire glanced at her, then gave a barely there nod of approval. Progress. It still wasn't easy. The sabotage hadn't stopped completely. Her files were untouched now, but side glances and muttered comments still crept into her days like cold drafts under a door. She learned to tune them out. She had bigger things to focus on. Evan had started looping her into more discussions, small projects at first, then larger initiatives. She got a chance to help draft a proposal for a sustainable housing investment project Carter, Lane was considering. It was the kind of initiative that felt close to her heart, real, grounded, something that could actually help people. She poured herself into it, staying up past midnight on more than one occasion, reading reports, building models, checking her numbers twice. The day of the pitch meeting, Maya stood outside the glass conference room with a stack of printed reports clutched in her hands. She wore the blazer Evan had gifted her a week earlier. Soft, charcoal gray, tailored just enough to fit, and with a handwritten note in the pocket. "No one wears it better." She hadn't told him how much that note meant.
She wasn't sure she could.
Inside the room, the senior partners gathered, murmuring in low tones. Claire stood at the head of the table, arms folded, nodding as one of the analysts made a dry comment about risk ratios. Maya's stomach twisted. She was supposed to present the preliminary findings. Nothing major, just a 3-minute summary. But her palms were sweating like she was about to address the United Nations. She stepped in just as the room quieted. All eyes turned to her. She cleared her throat. "Good morning. I've compiled the early projections for the Midtown Sustainable Housing Initiative. We focused on long-term ROI through community growth, job creation, and local reinvestment." She handed out her reports, voice steady. She didn't rush, didn't apologize. For the first time, she let herself stand tall. Not invisible, not apologetic, just present. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then one of the board members, a silver-haired man with sharp glasses, tapped the report. "These are impressive numbers." Claire glanced at Maya, then turned back to the table. She did the legwork. "I just supervised." Maya blinked, stunned. Was that praise from Claire? After the meeting, as the room emptied, Maya started to gather her things when someone behind her muttered, "She's not going away, is she?" She turned just in time to see Blake Carter, Evan's cousin and one of the firm's managing partners, smirking as he walked past. He wasn't subtle, never had been. Blake had made it clear from the start he didn't like her, didn't trust her, and didn't appreciate Evan's soft spot for projects. But Maya didn't flinch. Not this time. She just smiled and said, "Not anytime soon," before walking out. Later that afternoon, she found Evan leaning against the railing on the rooftop terrace, staring out over the city skyline. He was in shirt sleeves, his tie loosened, the breeze tugging at his hair. "You crushed it today," he said, without turning. "I didn't crash, at least," she replied, stepping beside him. He glanced at her, eyes warm. "Claire told me you're the reason the board greenlit the next phase." Maya exhaled, letting herself enjoy the moment. I didn't expect her to speak up. "She respects results," Evan said, "and she's not the only one." There was something different in his voice, softer, laced with pride. Maya looked over at him, the quiet hum of the city below rising like a lullaby. "You're doing it, Maya," he added. "You're proving them all wrong." She nodded slowly, the wind brushing against her face. Evan turned to face her fully. "Then, who are you doing it for?" She met his eyes. "Me." He smiled. "Good." And in that moment, on that rooftop, with the sun dipping behind the skyline and the scent of possibility thick in the air, Maya realized something she hadn't let herself believe until now. She belonged. Not because someone had made room for her, but because she had claimed it. The ballroom shimmered like a dream, gold chandeliers casting warm halos over clusters of elegantly dressed guests, their laughter and clinking glasses rising in soft crescendos above the gentle strains of live classical music. Waiters moved like dancers through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline, twinkling like 1,000 stars. But Maya barely noticed. She stood near one of the marble pillars, her fingers curled tightly round the stem of her untouched glass. The gown she wore, sleek, deep emerald, tailored to perfection, had arrived in a box on her bed that morning, complete with a handwritten note from Evan. "Thought you might like to stand out tonight. Thought you might like to stand out tonight." It fit like a dream, but on Maya, it felt like a costume. Around her, women spoke in soft, confident tones about hedge funds and art auctions. Men bragged about vacation homes in Tuscany and private jet mishaps as if they were punchlines. The world here sparkled too much, moved too fast. She felt like she was standing in the middle of someone else's life. "Maya," a familiar voice murmured at her side. She turned to see Evan, looking devastating in a tailored black suit, bow tie slightly loosened, his expression open and gentle. He seemed to read the discomfort on her face instantly. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She forced a smile, but it wavered, just taking it all in. He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "You don't have to stay long. I just wanted you to see this side of it." She nodded, eyes drifting to a woman laughing nearby, draped in diamonds that probably cost more than Maya's apartment. "It's a beautiful side," she admitted, "but it's not mine." Before Evan could respond, someone interrupted, an older man with a voice that carried and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There you are, Carter," the man boomed, clapping Evan on the back. He turned to Maya with thinly veiled curiosity. "And who's this charming young woman?" Evan straightened slightly. This is Maya Brooks. She's been working with us in business development." "Ah," the man said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "One of your promising new recruits?" Maya offered a polite smile, her stomach turning. The implication hung in the air like humidity, unspoken yet suffocating. Just another pretty face Evan had taken under his wing. Just another project. She excused herself before the heat in her cheeks could betray her. Out on the balcony, the crisp night air rushed to meet her, brushing cool fingers across her skin. She leaned on the railing, breathing deeply, eyes tracing the horizon. The city below was sprawling, glittering, alive, and she had never felt further from it. Footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Evan. "You always know when to find me," she said softly. "I always look for you," he replied. She turned to him. He hesitated. "Because you earned it. Because you belong here as much as anyone." She laughed, but there was no joy in it. These people, they talk about hedge funds like it's grocery shopping. I was excited last week because I found buy one, get one on frozen waffles. "That doesn't make you less," he said. "It makes me different." He stepped closer. She looked up at him, her voice quieter now. "I thought if I worked hard enough, dressed the part, spoke the lingo, maybe I'd stop feeling like I was pretending." Her shoulders dropped, but I haven't, not once. Evan's eyes searched hers, something tender blooming behind them. "So, what are you saying?" She looked down, her fingers tightening on the railing. "I don't think this world will ever feel like mine. And maybe that's not a bad thing. But it makes me wonder if I'm chasing something that doesn't fit." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "If this world doesn't fit," he said, "then maybe we find one that does. Together." Her breath caught. The words settled into her like a seed finding soil. Unexpected, quiet, but full of possibility. She turned toward him fully, uncertain but steadier now. "I don't want to pretend anymore." "Then don't," he said. "Just be you. That's all I've ever needed." Maya looked back at the glittering skyline, then down at the glass in her hand. Slowly, she set it on the railing and smiled. Not forced, not polite, but real. And for the first time that night, the world felt a little less foreign. The call came just after midnight. Maya had just finished brushing her teeth, hair tied up, feet aching from the heels she'd worn at yet another evening event for investors. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, expecting maybe a message from Claire or Evan. Instead, the screen lit up with a name she hadn't seen in weeks. Liam Brooks. She froze, then swiped answer. "Liam?" His voice was tight, strained. "Hey, I didn't want to worry you, but I..." Her heart dropped.
What? Why? What happened?
"I had this episode. Pain got bad, like really bad. I collapsed at the pharmacy." Maya sat down hard on the edge of the bed, the room suddenly spinning. "Oh my God, are you okay?" "What did the doctor say?" "They're running tests," he said. "They think it's a complication from the injury. I don't know." "Are you alone?" she asked, already standing, already reaching for her suitcase. "Yeah, but the nurses are nice," he said, trying to sound calm. Maya, they wouldn't give me the meds." She froze. What? Why not? They said the insurance flagged the account. Something about an expired claim. They said we owed too much and it needs to be settled before they'll release anything. Maya's throat tightened. That's insane. I'll fix it. Just hang tight. I'll call them. After they hung up, she paced the room, her mind racing. She opened her laptop, logged into the insurance portal, and saw the message blinking in red. Account flagged. Policy suspended. Outstanding balance. $1812.37. A sob caught in her chest. All those nights studying, working, trying to climb this impossible mountain, and her brother was lying in a hospital bed because she hadn't checked a stupid form. One missed payment. One bureaucratic failure. That's all it took to unravel everything. She grabbed her phone and called Evan. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. Maya?
Oh.
My brother, she said, voice trembling. He's in the hospital. They won't give him the meds. The insurance lapsed and her breath hitched. I don't know what to do. I'll take care of it, Evan said instantly. Send me the hospital name. No, she said quickly. Evan, I'm not calling for money. Maya, I can't keep taking from you. I already feel like I've borrowed a life that doesn't belong to me. There was a long silence. I never saw this as charity, he said finally. I saw someone worth investing in. Someone I care about. She closed her eyes, leaning against the wall. I know. But this is mine to fix. He didn't argue, just said softly, then I'm here when you need me. The next morning, she was on the first flight out. No gown, no laptop. Just jeans, a sweater, and her heart pounding with guilt. The hospital in Montana was smaller than she remembered, but the antiseptic smell was the same. Sharp and sterile, like it was trying too hard to hide the fear beneath. She found Liam in a shared room, hooked up to fluids, pale but grinning when he saw her. You didn't have to come. She hugged him so tightly the IV beeped in protest. Of course I did. Later that night, after settling him in with his prescriptions, paid for with the last of her savings, she sat outside the hospital on a bench beneath a flickering lamppost. The cold bit through her sleeves. But she didn't move. She watched her breath curl in the air, her mind blank. Everything she'd worked for in Seattle suddenly felt far away, like a half-remembered dream. And yet, something about being here with Liam grounded her. This was real, raw, it hurt, but it also mattered. When her phone buzzed again, she expected Evan. But it was Claire. Board's asking where you are. Evan stalling, but they're not happy. Call me. Maya stared at the message. In one world, she was building a future. In the other, she was holding her past together with her bare hands. She didn't call back. Not yet. Instead, she tilted her head toward the sky and whispered to no one. What am I supposed to choose? But the stars didn't answer. Only the wind, cold and quiet, brushing past like a reminder. No matter where she stood, something would always be left behind. The morning she left, the Seattle sky was gray, heavy with rain, as if the city itself had sensed her departure. Maya didn't tell anyone at Carter Wayne. Not Claire, not Evan. Especially not Evan. She packed her things quietly, left her badge on the desk, and slipped out just after sunrise. Her letter of resignation was short. Only a few lines, handwritten and folded neatly in an envelope, she slid under Evan's office door before walking away. Thank you for believing in me, but I need to find out who I am without all of this. The airport was a blur. So was the flight. She sat in her window seat, staring blankly out at the clouds, her reflection occasionally visible in the glass. The girl in the window didn't look like an executive assistant or a rising star or whatever label people had tried to give her over the last few weeks. She looked like Maya from Montana, with her brother's hospital bills still folded in her bag, and too many questions tucked behind her ribs. Back home, everything was the same and completely different. The apartment smelled like old laundry and takeout again. The leaky faucet in the kitchen had gotten worse. The heater still made that clunking noise when it kicked on. Liam's medication sat on the counter, sorted into labeled pill boxes she had filled that morning. He had smiled when she walked through the door, a quiet sort of smile that said he was both relieved and unsurprised to see her back. Maya didn't unpack. She didn't have the energy. Instead, she got her old job back at Rosie's Diner 2 days later. Betty, the owner, had hugged her a little too tight and said, "You were always the best one we had." Maya smiled, tucked her apron strings, and went back to pouring coffee and wiping counters. But something inside her had changed. The first week was hard. The quiet was too loud. She missed the rhythm of the office, the challenge of it, even the tension. She missed Evan most of all. His voice, his steady presence, the way he looked at her like she wasn't just surviving, but becoming. Every time the door at the diner chimed, she looked up too fast, heart leaping for something, or someone that wasn't there. She tried not to think about him. But memories clung to everything. The way he said her name, the note in the pocket of that gray blazer, the rooftop where he told her she belonged. Then came the journalist. He arrived on a Tuesday, wearing a rumpled blazer and the kind of glasses that made him look like he was always about to ask tough questions. He slid into a booth and ordered black coffee, then asked, "You Maya Brooks?" She stiffened. "Depends who's asking." He gave a tight smile. "Daniel Keene. I write for the Pacific Ledger. Cover business profiles, wealth, power, scandal. That sort of thing." Maya blinked. "Okay. Why are you here?" He leaned forward. "You were Evan Carter's assistant, right? You disappeared the same week he resigned from the board of Carter Lane." Her stomach dropped. He resigned, walked out. No explanation. Board's in chaos. No one's seen him since. Maya sat back, her heart pounding in her ears. The journalist studied her. "People are saying it had something to do with you. That he left to find you." She swallowed, throat dry. "That's not. I didn't ask him to do that." "I'm not saying you did," he said. "But you might be the only one who understands why he'd throw away a billion-dollar empire overnight." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Not when her thoughts were spinning, not when her chest felt like it might cave in. After he left, she stood behind the counter for a long time, staring at the same coffee pot she had filled 1,000 times before. Evan had left it all. Evan had left it all, everything he'd built, and he hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't tried to find her. Or had he? The next morning, Maya took the long way to work, walking past the park near their old high school, past the grocery store where she and Liam used to scrape together coupons, past the streets that still remembered who she used to be. She breathed it all in. The past, the present, the ache of it. Then she went back to the diner, tied her apron, and kept moving. Because even if he had left it all behind, she didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But something deep inside her whispered, maybe the story isn't over. The bell above Rosie's diner door jingled like it always did. Sharp, cheerful, familiar. Maya didn't even look up from the register. It was early afternoon, the lull between lunch and dinner rush, and she was elbow deep in napkin refills and receipt tapes. Rain pattered lightly against the window, a soft percussion in the background of the country song playing faintly on the jukebox. The world, at least on the surface, was quiet again. "Sit wherever you like," she said automatically, flipping the register drawer shut. But the air shifted. Something in the room changed. She glanced up and froze. Standing in the doorway, water dripping from the hem of his coat, was Evan Carter. He wasn't in a suit. No sharp-pressed collar, no designer shoes. Just jeans, a navy button-down rolled at the sleeves, and damp curls falling loosely over his forehead. His eyes searched the room until they landed on her, and when they did, Maya forgot how to breathe. Neither of them spoke. For a long, aching moment, they just stared. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. Maya felt her hand tighten around the counter edge. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. "I was looking for you," he said, his tone low, steady. She swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have come." He nodded once, taking the words in, but not turning away. "I tried to go back," he said after a pause, "to the company, the meetings, the boardroom. The view from the top." His gaze flickered across the diner. The view from the top. The view from the top. The fainted booths, the walls. But none of it mattered, not without you. Maya's breath caught in her chest. "I kept thinking I'd feel like myself again," he continued. "If I just buried myself in work, maybe I'd stop hearing your voice in my head every time something reminded me of you." He offered a quiet, almost broken laugh, but it never stopped. She didn't move. "I left everything," he said, "because I realized it didn't mean anything if I couldn't share it with you." She looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was tired, more so than when she last saw him. But it was honest, raw. There was no polished mask, no calm CO exterior. Just Evan. "I didn't leave because I didn't care," she said, her voice trembling now. "I left because I didn't know if I'd ever fit into that world. I didn't want to keep trying to be someone else." "I don't want you to be anyone else," he said, stepping closer. "I want you, as you are, wherever you are." She blinked hard against the burn behind her eyes. "You don't need to say that." "I'm not saying it because I need to," he said, softer now. "I'm saying it because it's true." They stood there, two people who had traveled impossible distances. Across cities, across social divides, across fear and pride and doubt, only to end up facing each other in the place where it all began. Maya took a shaky breath. "You left your whole empire, for me." He gave her a crooked smile.
I left it for myself, but I came here for you.
Her heart ached in the best, worst way. He reached across the counter slowly, as if not to startle her, his fingers brushing against hers. "I don't care where we are. A diner, a city, a mountaintop. I just want to build something real. With you." Maya looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. And for once, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. Not to him. Not to the world. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just a girl trying to survive. She wasn't just a girl trying to survive. She was someone who had made a man like Evan Carter see what really mattered. She stepped around the counter and stood in front of him, close enough to hear the steady beat of his heart. Then, without another word, she reached for his hand, laced her fingers with his, and pulled him into an embrace that felt like coming home. Rain tapped gently against the windows. The jukebox played on. And just like that, the girl from Montana and the man who had lost everything found the one thing they never expected: each other. The weeks that followed felt like stepping into a life Maya had only ever imagined in quiet daydreams. Except it wasn't a fantasy. It was real. Evan didn't ask her to pack up and leave again. Didn't suggest plane tickets or penthouses or job offers. He simply stayed. In a small town where his name meant nothing, in a diner that didn't serve truffle oil, in a world where she felt grounded. And more than anything, Maya loved him for that. They took things slowly. Evan rented a modest house just outside of town, a cozy place with creaky wooden floors and a front porch where they drank coffee in the mornings. Maya continued working at Rosie's for a while longer, not because she had to, but because she had to, but because she wanted to, because that place reminded her of who she was before everything changed, and how far she'd come. One afternoon, she found Evan sitting at their kitchen table with papers spread across the surface, a pencil tucked behind his ear, and a mug of tea going cold beside his elbow. "What are you working on?" she asked, walking over to peek. He looked up, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. "Different." She leaned closer, scanning the header. "Community Business Incubator Proposal. Brooks Carter Initiative." Her brows lifted. "This has my name on it." "Because it's yours, too," he said, tapping the page. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not fitting into a world that wasn't built for you. So maybe we build one that is, for people like us, people who need a second chance, who just need someone to bet on them." She stared at the proposal, at the careful breakdowns of funding, resources, mentorship programs for low-income locales with big ideas and no access. It was beautiful, bold, and completely unexpected. "You want to do this?" "Here." He nodded. "If you're with me." Maya sat beside him, her heart full in a way that scared her. "I'm with you." The months that followed were a whirlwind. They secured a space, a shuttered warehouse at the edge of town that had once been a mechanic shop. They painted the walls themselves, furnished it with donated desks, refurbished computers, and hung a sign above the door that simply read, "The Launchpad." Evan used his connections to bring in guest mentors, while Maya worked directly with the applicants, helping them polish their pitches and believe in their ideas. And they came. Single parents with recipes they'd perfected for years, veterans with inventions drawn on napkins, teenagers with dreams too big for small towns. Maya was everywhere, organizing workshops, brewing coffee, encouraging strangers. She was thriving, not just surviving. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a guest in someone else's story. One night, long after everyone had gone home, Maya stood alone in the middle of the Launchpad's main room, the scent of fresh paint and warm light wrapping around her like a blanket. She heard Evan walk in, his footsteps familiar now, easy. "You always stay late," he said. "I like hearing it breathe," she replied, smiling. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist. "We did." There was a long pause. Then he whispered, "I've loved you since that night at the diner." She turned in his arms, her eyes shining. "I think I started loving you the moment you said you wouldn't forget." He kissed her then, soft, steady, and certain. It wasn't a kiss of beginnings. It was a kiss of becoming. Sometime later, as they locked up and stepped out into the quiet night, Maya glanced back at the glowing windows of the Launchpad. She thought of the girl she used to be, sleepless, hungry, scared, standing behind a counter, with nothing but a plate of food and a stubborn kind of hope. That girl had given everything she had to someone she didn't know. And somehow, that one choice had rewritten the rest of her story. Love hadn't saved her. Kindness had. And in the end, that kindness brought her exactly where she belonged. Home. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Maya's story reminds us that kindness, especially the quiet kind, the kind that asks for nothing in return, can ripple out and change lives in ways we may never see coming. It wasn't wealth or power or ambition that transformed Maya's future. It was a simple act of compassion given on a rainy night to a stranger with tired eyes. That single choice opened a door neither of them knew existed. Too often, we underestimate our own worth because of where we come from, how little we have, or the mistakes in our past. But Maya showed us that grit, honesty, and a good heart can be more powerful than any resume. And Evan, he reminded us, that success means nothing without someone to share it with, and that true strength lies in vulnerability. The most valuable lesson here is this: never think your kindness goes unnoticed. Never assume your small acts don't matter, because sometimes one plate of food, one conversation, one moment of seeing someone when no one else does, change everything. So wherever you are in life, whether you're at your lowest or climbing your way to the top, choose kindness. Stay true to yourself, and don't be afraid to build your own version of home, even if the world says it doesn't look the way it should. Did this story move you? Have you ever experienced a moment where a small act of kindness made a big difference? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. If stories like this speak to your heart, make sure to subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories and never miss the next tale of love, resilience, and the quiet power of doing the right thing, even when no one's watching. Until next time, take care of each other.